Ever wonder what it was like to be the smart kid in ancient times? You know, the one who raised their hand too much while everyone else tried to blend in. Throughout history, being intelligent was both a blessing and a curse, admired one moment and mocked the next. Join us as we explore the hilarious lives of brainiacs in 4 amazing civilizations: ancient Egypt, Greece, China, and the Maya. From dodging pharaohs to debating life's biggest questions, these historical geniuses faced chaos and comedy daily. So grab a scroll, or your phone, and enjoy the ride. After all, being a smart person in history was like being a rock star. Everyone loved you until they didn't. Ancient Egypt. Picture this, you're living in ancient Egypt, it's 2500 BC, and you're one of the few people who understands geometry, the ancient version of a superpower. Congratulations! You're about to be very popular with the pharaoh. In Egypt, being smart didn't mean knowing fun facts about history or literature. It meant you could calculate angles and manage laborers without losing your mind. Because guess what? The pharaoh wants you to build a massive pyramid, taller than anything anyone has ever seen, with the precision of a watchmaker. And if you mess up, well, let's just say there won't be a second chance. But being a genius in Egypt was more than just a 9-to-5 job. Your work had to be perfect. Why? Because this wasn't just any structure. The pyramid was supposed to be a direct staircase to the heavens, where the pharaoh would live out his afterlife with the gods. If one block was even a degree off, people would panic about the pharaoh getting lost on his way to eternal paradise. So no pressure there. And the sand? It's everywhere. In your shoes, in your clothes, in your hair. Egyptian geniuses must have hated sand like it was a personal insult. You might even joke with your friends. Hey, if you need me, I'll be at the beach. Again! As an ancient Egyptian smarty pants, you probably had a few side hustles too, like keeping track of the flooding of the Nile. They'd drag you out of bed to inspect the river levels, because if you didn't calculate things right, the crops wouldn't grow, and the whole society might just run out of bread. And oh yes, you had to be a bit of a cat lover. Egyptians worshipped cats to the point where they'd cry over a lost pet like it was a national tragedy. If your house had a few cats wandering in and out, you were practically seen as a cat-whispering prophet. You could probably write a bestseller called How to Communicate with Cats in 10 Easy Steps. But there was a downside. If you got a little too smart and started questioning the whole pharaoh as a living god concept, it wouldn't go well. Maybe they'd just ignore you, or maybe they'd decide that you'd make a great addition to the afterlife, a little sooner than expected. And no, they wouldn't let you take your cats. Lesson learned. Be clever, stay humble, love cats, and whatever you do, don't let your geometry be off by even a millimeter. Ancient Greece. Welcome to ancient Greece, around 500 BC, where being smart meant that people either loved you or thought you were completely bonkers. In Greece, the real celebrities weren't athletes or actors. They were philosophers, which is just a fancy word for people who love asking big questions. And if you happen to be good at asking, you might become a local legend. The Greeks took thinking very seriously. In fact, they took it so seriously that they'd debate things like, what is beauty? Or what's the purpose of life? Like they were arguing about the best wine in the tavern. So where did you, the ancient Greek smart person, go to think deep thoughts? The gymnasium. Yes, you read that right. The gymnasium wasn't just for training muscles. It was a hub for big ideas. Imagine trying to impress your friends with your brilliant theory about the universe while people are jogging and lifting weights nearby. Hey buddy, that's great, but maybe keep it down. I'm trying to lift this boulder. Smart Greeks would literally walk around the city, pestering people with philosophical questions like it was an Olympic sport. It was basically ancient Greek Twitter, except instead of tweets, you had to actually talk to people face to face. Then there were the sophists, the pros of philosophy, who would even charge money to teach you how to argue. They were basically the ancient Greek debate coaches. But the true rock star of smarts was Socrates. He was known for his Socratic method, which was just a fancy way of saying he'd ask you so many questions that you'd start doubting everything you thought you knew. People loved him, but he also drove the authorities crazy. Eventually, they got so fed up with him that they put him on trial for corrupting the youth. His punishment? He had to drink poison. So much for job security. And the most ironic part? People still quote him today. If you weren't a fan of Socrates' method, you could always go hang out with Plato, who was a bit less intense and loved to write down everything his teacher Socrates said. Or Aristotle, who was the first person to try to catalog, well, everything. Seriously, he classified animals, plants, ethics, and more, as if he was the first walking encyclopedia. Imagine being Aristotle and thinking, I'm going to classify every single animal on this planet, starting with the ones that bite. Of course, being a philosopher meant you had to dress the part. To fit in, you'd sport a flowing toga, which was fantastic for making dramatic gestures, but terrible if you were trying to eat soup. You might end up looking like you were trying to reenact a scene from a Greek tragedy instead of just enjoying a meal. Lesson learned. In ancient Greece, being smart was cool, but also dangerous. People loved a good thinker, as long as they weren't asked too many questions. Ancient China. Now we travel to ancient China around 200 AD, where if you were smart, you were known as a scholar, and you'd probably spend half your life locked in a tiny room with nothing but ink, scrolls, and a lifetime supply of rice cakes. Why? Because in China, being smart meant you had to pass a test, and not just any test, but the most grueling, mind-boggling exams ever invented. Imagine the SATs, stretched out for 3 days with no bathroom breaks. That's basically what they were dealing with. They called it the Imperial Examination, and only the brainiest survived. If you passed, you were guaranteed a top-tier government job, complete with fancy robes and a whole lot of respect. People would bow to you, literally, and your family would be bursting with pride. The idea was that only the smartest, wisest people should help run the government, and they were willing to weed out anyone who wasn't up to the task, even if it meant 10 years of prep work. But the test was brutal. The exam halls were crammed with candidates, each one locked in a cubicle with a hole in the door so food could be slipped through. And it wasn't just one test, there were levels. If you passed one, you moved up to the harder one, and then another, and then another. By the end of it, only a few super scholars would actually make it through. Congratulations, you've unlocked the next level of studying. Might as well have been a slogan. If you were a scholar in training, life was tough. You had to memorize hundreds of Confucian teachings, and the material was so long that some scholars literally went bald from stress. And if you failed, well, you could always try again, next year. There were some folks who spent decades trying to pass. But if you made it, you were set for life, and could finally enjoy a break from the endless study sessions. Imagine finally finishing all those tests, sitting back and saying, okay, where's my cake? I earned it. For those who didn't make it through the exams, life wasn't as glamorous. They usually became teachers or tutors, encouraging the next generation of test takers. And maybe, just maybe, they'd whisper a few study tips to help them survive the grueling ordeal. Listen kid, just remember, if you don't pass, you can always become a street performer. That's a backup plan, right? The scholars would gather together, forming study groups that were more like support groups. They'd sip tea and grumble about the unfairness of the exams, while practicing their calligraphy skills, pretending that was actually part of their study plan. Remember, if we don't get this right, it's a lifetime of rice cakes and sadness. Lesson learned. Being smart in ancient China meant being able to memorize 1,000 Confucian sayings and having the endurance to sit through days of exams. And maybe keeping a little tea and patient on hand for good luck. The Maya. Now we're off to the jungles of Central America, where the Maya civilization was thriving around 600 AD. Here, being smart wasn't about decades of exam. Nope. The Maya smart folks were part scientists, part priests, and full-on astrologers. They spent their days observing the stars and creating some of the most advanced calendars known to history. If you were one of the brainy types, you'd probably spend hours gazing at the night sky, taking notes, and then reporting your findings to the ruler. In Maya society, the calendar was everything, and smart people were the keepers of time itself. Maya didn't just have one calendar, they had three. Yes, 3 calendars to track everything, from agricultural cycles to sacred religious events. Imagine trying to explain why a festival couldn't happen on Wednesday because it wasn't sacred enough. If you were a Maya smarty pants, it was your job to make sure everything lined up perfectly. And if something went wrong, you'd have to explain to the whole community why their crops were failing. People looked to the sky for answers, so if you messed up, well, let's just say people didn't forget easily. Hey, remember that time Juan predicted the rain and we ended up with a drought? Good times. The good news was that the Maya smart people were pretty respected, almost like rock stars. You'd sit at the top of temples, calculating the days and teaching people about the sun, the moon, and why the stars were such a big deal. But with this stargazing came responsibility. Predicting a solar eclipse wrong was like telling people there'd be no rain for years and then having a storm blow in the next day. No pressure. Sure, everyone, trust me. What could possibly go wrong? If you did your job right though, life was sweet. The rulers relied on your expertise to plan wars, ceremonies, and pretty much everything else. You'd get a prime seat at every festival, and all of the best corn-based treats. But step out of line and you'd be shunned faster than you could say sacred cycle. No one wants to be the person who ruined the harvest festival because of a miscalculation. On festival days, you'd be expected to show off your astronomical skills, perhaps even doing a little moon dance or something equally theatrical to impress the crowds. Look, I can tell you when the next eclipse is coming, right after I finish this corn on the cob. Conclusion. Throughout history, being smart was always a blessing and a curse. In ancient Egypt, you built monumental structures and dodged angry pharaohs. In Greece, you argued your way into fame, but risked poison if you annoyed the wrong person. In China, you faced brutal exams, and with the Maya, you calculated the heavens under pressure. So next time you think being the smart one is tough, remember that at least you're not juggling pyramids, poisons, and star charts in ancient sandals. Being a historical brainiac was like being the lead singer of a rock band. Everyone loved you until they didn't. Just remember, whether you're in the age of pharaohs or philosophers, it's always best to keep your wits about you, invest in some good sandals, and maybe think about adopting a few cats along the way.